I want to introduce to you guys today our first speaker, Dr. Pryor. She studies literature and culture and the soul, and she's going to be coming up here to tell us about the imagination and things like that. She lives in Virginia with her husband on a really cool farm, it sounds like, and she's got 2 dogs named Ruby and Eva and 4 chickens, which I thought was wonderful. So if you guys wouldn't mind helping me welcome Dr. Pryor.
Thank you. I think the chickens really miss me. Not really. All right, so I do want to tell you that I'm going to watch the time closely and try to pace myself because we are going to have Q&A, and I love Q&A, so please be thinking of the questions you want to ask, and we'll have a good, hopefully, robust discussion afterwards. But first, I want you to just imagine that you are in my classroom and we are studying Victorian literature. Any English majors in here? Woohoo! All right, yes. So in my teaching years, I taught a lot of Victorian literature. My area of specialty is 18th century, so Victorian literature is a century later, but it kind of all blends together. And so I ended up teaching a lot of Victorian literature, and I taught in the context of an evangelical university. And sometimes I would teach this literature to students who are in general education classes, who are just taking the class because they have to. But sometimes I would teach upper level classes to English majors, the nerdiest students of all. I love them. So the Victorian age, as well as the literature that it produced, is, of course, named after Queen Victoria, who reigned in Great Britain from 1837 to 1901. But the period is often marked in its beginning a little bit before that in 1830, because this was the year that the nation's first reform bill was introduced, setting off a series of social and political reforms that would define the age. From the expansion of voting rights, not just the expansion, there was still a lot left to be desired, but voting rights were expanded, legal protections were increased for laborers, for children especially. So it was a heady age marked by rapid change, optimism, prosperity, and progress, and all undergirded by the evangelical faith that had grown increasingly influential throughout the previous century. So now if we are in this classroom and you are an evangelical student, as most of my students have been, over the course of the semester as we read this literature, you might begin to notice something, a pattern emerging in much of this Victorian literature. You will see in both the texts and their surrounding historical context qualities strangely similar to many of the defining characteristics of modern American evangelical culture. And by seeing in that literature many of the values and beliefs prominent within American evangelicalism today, you might find yourself wondering whether some of the ideas that characterize today's evangelical culture are Christian or simply Victorian. Thank you. She's tracking with me, and we're going to get to this. In case you weren't, we'll get there. So the origins and continuing power of some of the primary images, metaphors, and stories of the evangelical movement, which began around 300 years ago, and those of the Victorian period sit right in the middle of this classroom, these discussions that we would have, this story. Most scholars agree that evangelicals, who, as I said, emerged a century before in the early 18th century, created much of the ethos that defined the Victorian age. And this ethos defines much of evangelicalism and the American church today. As the historian Timothy Larson says, he writes frequently on both Victorian and evangelicals, quote, almost all of the issues that we are wrestling with today that have salience for us, the Victorians had a version of that conversation that is still ongoing. Yet, in my own context, in the classroom and outside it, inside the church walls and outside of them, I have found that not enough of those conversations are happening. Instead, the religious beliefs and cultural currents that birthed the evangelical movement in the 18th century and manifested as political and social values in the centuries that followed, for good and for bad, there's both. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, as Dickens said. It's true. These values that have existed for all these centuries exist now as unexamined assumptions swirling within the Christian imagination. If Christianity is a house, then these unexamined assumptions, that's a phrase I'll keep returning to, then these unexamined assumptions are its floor joists, wall studs, beams, and rafters, holding everything together, but unseen, covered over by tile, paint, paper, and ceilings. And what we don't see, we tend not to think about until something goes wrong and something needs replacement or restoration or reform. Christians, our house is badly in need of repair. We must confess with Augustine about ourselves and about the church. My soul's house is too meager for you to visit, he says. It is falling down. Rebuild it. Inside are things that would disgust you to see. I confess this, and I know it. But who's going to clean it? The crisis facing the American church today, which is manifest in increasing division, polarization, maybe you've heard, decreasing church membership and attendance, mounting revelations of abuse and cover-ups of abuse, and an ongoing reckoning with our racist past and present, is one in which the decorative layers that have long adorned the evangelical house are being peeled away. Now we can see, some of us for the first time, some of us maybe not for the first time, the foundational parts of its structure. And some of these parts are solid. Some are rotten. Some can be salvaged. Some ought not to be saved. Many have said that what has been exposed within the American church in recent days, months, and years is apocalyptic. And it is. Many truths that have been hidden are being brought to light. Many deeds that have been covered up are being uncovered. Many assumptions that have been unexamined are being brought to the surface and scrutinized in order that we may consider whether or not they are rooted in eternal truths or merely in human traditions. And in this hard, dirty, and often discouraging process, I have some good news. Jesus is revealing more of himself. As he said to his Father in Matthew 11:25, "You have hidden these things from the wise and learned and revealed them to little children." And it is significant that the word translated in many versions of the Bible as revealed in this verse is the Greek word for apocalypse. Some of what is hidden from us is spiritual reality, divine truths that can be revealed to us only through God's power. But some of what is hidden from us, or has been hidden for so long, remains so because of our own limited human nature, along with our habits, practices, and traditions. Human beings and cumulatively human cultures develop language, stories, metaphors, images, ideas, and imaginations that shed light on some corners of reality only to cast shadows in other places. Every good story offers a slice of reality. Every true metaphor illuminates certain likenesses. Every beautiful image has a frame. Each of these reveals something, but also leaves something out. We see through a glass darkly, as Paul reminds us. Now, there's no limit to the things that fill the Christian imagination. There is no one single Christian imagination. But I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that I think have formed our own imagination, particularly in our context in the American church of the 21st century. But first, we need to start with the basics. What is imagination? Many of us associate imagination with children's playtime, creative problem solving, and hobbits. No comment. For those of us who think of imagination in these ways, imagination might seem merely to be a fun but optional exercise, enjoyable but indulgent. We also tend to think of it as an individual ability or gift. Use your imagination, we might say, or she's really imaginative, we might say about someone else. Most of us aren't likely to think of imagination as something arising from our communal experience and exerting tremendous influence on our social lives, let alone on our religious beliefs and practices. But the power of the imagination is large, pervasive, and overwhelming. Imagination entails much more than our own individual fancies and visions, and its hold on us reaches far beyond the limits of our own individual minds. The imagination shapes us and our world more than any other human power or ability. Communities, societies, movements, and yes, even religions are formed and fueled by the power of the imagination. Now, at its most literal level, the word imagination refers to the mind's process of making an image, an act of imaging. In this way, imagination as a concept, as a word, is simple. And it also makes us think of it as something very individual and solitary, and it is that. Yet much surrounds this image-making activity that includes far more than an individual sitting there making an image independently in one's mind. The images our minds make are drawn from the objects we perceive. And what we perceive depends on what makes up our surroundings. And it also depends on what we're paying attention to. And what we pay attention to derives from a host of experiences, associations, emotions, thoughts, practices, and habits. Do you have the habit of looking up when you walk? Then you will notice things above and around you. Do you have the habit of staring at your phone as you go through your day? Then you will notice far less of the physical things above and around you. Just as our dreams are filled with the things that fill our days, so too is our imagination formed by the things we perceive. Reality as we understand it is what registers. And some of us, we all know, especially myself, have to see, hear, or read something half a dozen times before it actually registers. And I will, because I am an English professor, recite a short poem here at this moment. It's an illustration of what I said just a little bit ago about how what we perceive and what we pay attention to takes on meaning. And if we don't see it or perceive it or pay attention to it, then we don't have any meaning around it. So the poem, which I often spend an entire 50-minute class discussing, but I won't do that here, is this. So much depends on a red wheelbarrow glazed with rain. Wait, now I messed it up. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater by the white chickens. And I really did just mess it up. Who's got it? Surrounded by white. Somebody look that up, please. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater by the white chickens. Yes, thank you. I've got it. That's it. Prepositions. Now, this short poem, it is poetry for you skeptics out there. It's a poem written by the great early 20th century American poet William Carlos Williams, who was a doctor by day. That was his day job. And you don't need to know this about the poem, but it is interesting and helpful. He wrote or composed this poem as he was sitting at the bedside of a dying child. We don't know, this is back in the day when doctors made house calls, we don't know what happened to the child, we don't know why the child was dying, but he was sitting there at the bedside looking out the window, saw the wheelbarrow, saw it glazed with rainwater, saw the white chickens, and realized that so much depends on those things. But what, in short, the poem really means is that so much depends on our perception of these things, our ability to see them, recognize, and understand the meaning behind them, just by looking at a wheelbarrow. You could write a great poem that people study and read 100 years later. Now, this ability of the mind, of the human mind, to imagine, to make images, reflects, of course, the marvelous fact that we are made in the image of God. We are the product of his imagination in a very literal way, in the sense that he imaged us, he made us in his image. And it also is important in a metaphorical sense, because we are like him. And so, we're kind of a metaphor, right? Or a simile, if you want to be technical about it, but we'll get into that later. The ability to imagine, which seems to be unique to humans of all animals, is a reminder of the one whose image we are made in. This is why of the greatest philosophers on the imagination, one of the greatest philosophers on the imagination, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, characterizes the human imaginative act as, quote, a repetition in the finite mind, that's us, our minds are finite, of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. That's how Coleridge defines the human imagination as a part of being made in God's image. Indeed, even the incarnation, God in the image and as human flesh, is a work of God's imagination, for Christ is the image of the invisible God. We who are made in God's image from his imagination reflect our Creator's image through our acts of imagination. Imagination engages our whole humanity, physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual. This truth is the starting point of any right understanding of the imagination, its role, power, and significance. Imagination is really such a simple concept in one way, and yet our ideas about the workings and wonders of the imagination have a long and complicated history, and I will cover just a little bit of it here. Like all of the marvels of human abilities, imagination has been idealized and debased and held in every valuation in between. At times, imagination has been understood as merely a kind of physical, mechanistic, mental function, like I said, the ability to recreate an image in the mind, which is very mechanical, very Enlightenment era idea, while at other times it has been treated as mystical or even magical. Indeed, from the myth of Prometheus to the creation and fall story told in Genesis to the prohibition against graven images given in the second commandment, the powers associated with the imagination and the making of images were in ancient times often linked to human transgressions into powers reserved for the divine. Some of that carries over into today in the way we sometimes imagine artists to be mad geniuses or especially sensitive souls. And sometimes they are. Painted in the broadest strokes, the history of how we imagine imagination consists of two parts. First, the imagination was understood generally as a mirror, then later as a lamp. Imagination as a mirror is seen in the classical tradition, where imagination and its associated activities are understood primarily in terms of imitation or mimesis. For Plato, the idealist whose ideas were and continue to be influential, imitation is by its very nature inferior at best and dangerous at worst. For Plato, imitation is but a shadow of true reality, and as an illusory shadow, it has power to lead us away from what is real if we mistake imitation for its source. Plato's student Aristotle, however, disagreed with his teacher and argued powerfully in Poetics in favor of the value of the imitative arts. Aristotle saw in imitation both the pleasure of learning as well as the opportunity to practice through art the habits that lead to virtue in life. But a radical shift in the way we think about imagination occurred in the modern age. With the Enlightenment, imagination came under closer consideration along with other human faculties and abilities. At the height of the Enlightenment, the imagination became an object of fascination for writers and philosophers, reaching its peak in published texts, coincidentally or not, right around 1776. Does anyone here play with the Google Ngram viewer? I'm obsessed with it. If you don't know what it is, ask in the Q&A. But you can just look up words and phrases as they appear in the database of Google's database of printed texts. And imagination peaks in 1776. There was something else that happened that year. I don't know. You can remind me later. But that was the year the term peaked. And even as the term rose to its highest prominence, it did so in an age in which that might seem ironic, because the Enlightenment is so closely linked to science, rationalism, and reason, yet it also brought the human ability to imagine to the fore, too. We don't always think about how those go together. So reason and imagination are by no means as opposed to one another as they are commonly thought today to be. What they share is, in fact, central to the ethos of human invention, which is at the heart of the Enlightenment and the modern age it birthed. After all, the scientific revolution and all its discoveries were the fruit of the powers of the human mind, not just rational, but also imaginative. Beginning in the 18th century, philosophers, poets, and critics developed particular interests in nuanced categories of intellectual ability, such as wit, fancy, judge, and imagination. Imagination began to be seen as being capable of far more than mere imitation. It became to be understood as a faculty responsible for invention and creativity. And of course, this view took even further flight in the Romantic age of the following century, and imagination has never looked the same since. The imagination's ability to create and invent new or seemingly new things, rather than to merely imitate what was already in existence, became the source of growing fascination. And as imagination became increasingly understood as a phenomenon connected to perception, imagination was conceived of more of a subjective experience based on personal, sensory, and emotional experience, rather than an objective one based on the mind's ability to replicate in the mind an object outside itself. So we see a shift from an imagination as a function of objectivity to one as more a function of subjectivity. Imagination moved from being viewed as mechanistic to organic, from intellectual to sensory. And not that these functions are separate or can be separated from each other, but we often tend to think of them that way. And of course, even these terms themselves are metaphorical, which I'll talk about more later, so in that sense, they're also imaginary. Because perception is the ground of imagination in this new understanding, the new philosophical field of aesthetics, which also arose in the 18th century, was closely tied to emerging ideas about imagination. Aesthetics, which is the philosophical study of beauty, is directly connected to sensory perception and therefore to subjective bodily experience. While the objective world exists around us, our imagination draws only, again, from what we perceive, and we primarily perceive what we attend to. This way of understanding the relationship between the objective world and subjective experience, which constitutes the field of philosophy called phenomenology, now informs the way we think about both aesthetic experiences and imagination. One of the great influences on my thinking is James K.A. Smith. In his book, Imagining the Kingdom, he describes imagination as a, quote, kind of faculty by which we navigate and make sense of our world, but in ways and on a register that flies below the radar of conscious reflection, and specifically in ways that are fundamentally aesthetic in nature. If you know Smith, this idea is familiar to you. He says it more succinctly in a number of his works that kind of boil down to his central thesis. is that human beings are more than heads on sticks. We are desiring creatures before we are thinking creatures, following Augustine. So what he's saying here is that desire and subjectivity that's below the conscious level forms us and drives us more than we think, more than just what we're, apologies to my apologetics people. It's not just about making arguments. It's also about getting to our subjective aesthetic experience below the conscious level. Okay, I'll get more deeply into this. I just want to make sure you're all tracking with me. Okay, longer quote from Smith. He says, much of our action is not the fruit of conscious deliberation. Instead, much of what we do grows out of our passional orientation to the world, affected by all the ways we've been primed to perceive the world. In short, our action emerges from how we imagine the world. This is still Smith, I'm quoting. And that shaping of our character is, to a great extent, the effect of stories that have captivated us, that have sunk into our bones, stories that picture what we think life is about, what constitutes the good life. We live into the stories we've absorbed. We become characters in the drama that has captivated us. Thus, much of our action is acting out a kind of script that has unconsciously captured our imaginations. End quote. Now, we can think about this in a very philosophical way, as I seem to be doing here. But we can also relate this, I think, more directly to our lives in lots of ways. If some of you out there have had very bad dating experiences, I don't think you use that word anymore, dating, but you know what I'm talking about, right? I don't know, is that the word? I don't even know what the words are anymore. Talking to people. You have some stories around that. And you're going to carry those stories with you into the next time you're talking to someone, right? Or, a little less humorous, people who've experienced some kind of extreme trauma or abuse. There are entire books on this about how you carry those stories, not just in your head, but in your bones. And it affects the way that you perceive the world and therefore the way you respond to the world around you. Whether rightly or wrongly, it's there. So in this way, Smith says, perception is already an evaluation. Again, we perceive what we pay attention to. We act based on what we imagine about the objective external world, and yet we also imagine based on what we perceive and receive from the world. Thus, again, this is Smith, the function of the imagination is such that it never merely copies the world or translates perceptions. It is a constantly active and creative faculty that shapes the world we perceive and that uses our hopes, fears, and other emotions in that shaping, end quote. This meaning-making function of the imagination connects it directly to our religious belief, our faith understanding, because religion is the ultimate source and arbiter of meaning. So clearly, imagination is not just making an image in the mind's eye. The images we make are drawn from what we attend to, and what we attend to are the things that already have meaning for us and create more meaning too. The images we make arise from and make meaning out of our lives. So it is impossible then to separate the role our religious belief has in directing our perceptions and meaning making, and the role our perceptions and meaning making have on our theological understanding. So these theological implications of imagination work on both an individual level and a cultural one. Because imagination is a reflection of God's image in all human beings, that is suggestive for how we treat the imaginative work of ourselves and others' individual imaginations, for one thing. Our own individual imaginations create dreams for the future, plans for our next vacation, conjectures about the meeting our boss asked us to have tomorrow, and countless works of music, poetry, and art. We're imagining things about these things all the time. Collectively, the works of imagination that are part of our culture reflects and creates that culture in turn. Sculptures uphold standards of beauty as well as Instagram pictures. Love songs shape our views of love. Movies give us images of sexual encounters that establish new norms and expectations. All of this is what Percy Bysshe Shelley was talking about when he famously said, "Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world." Our art sets standards for us and forms our imaginations and desires in ways we may not consciously realize. The philosopher Charles Taylor calls these kinds of frameworks that are collected together in our culture social imaginaries. In his early work, Modern Social Imaginaries, Charles Taylor defines the social imaginary as a culture's shared pool of images, stories, and legends that shape one's social existence and expectations, or, quote, the deeper normative notions and images that underlie these expectations. A social imaginary forms a common understanding, Taylor says, that enables us to carry out the collective practices that make up our social life. This understanding is both factual and normative. That is, we have a sense of how things usually go, but this is interwoven with an idea of how they ought to go. Now, I am going to boil this down to some more concrete examples in a few minutes. This is just Taylor's definition. So in other words, what Taylor is saying is that our social imaginary, now again, over at dinner we were talking about how using the word imaginary as a noun is a little odd when you first encounter it, but think of an imaginary as a pool. It's a pool of stories, images, metaphors. It includes our language. If we have this pool that we may not even be aware of because we've just inherited it, which is what Taylor says, it's just part of our, and we don't just have one, we have many because we're part of different communities. It is both descriptive and prescriptive. It makes a particular practice possible, but it also is the practice that largely carries the understanding forward. Our practices, Taylor says, both reflect and maintain self-conceptions and modes of understanding. Again, we can think, if you've done any kind of travel around the world, you could think of a simple example of just simply going to a different place and their manners or their customs are just a little bit different. You know, the way they line up might be different than the way they do somewhere else. And no one told you that, but if you have an expectation of how it should go and it doesn't go that way because everyone else is doing something differently and no one told you, you've encountered one of those images or metaphors that's part of a social imaginary. This idea is, the best way that I can communicate it to you is given by a 2005 commencement speech that's pretty famous. You'll find it in a lot of works talking about this or in other contexts, given by the late writer David Foster Wallace. Maybe you've heard this. And this is in his speech. He says, "There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, 'Morning, boys, how's the water?' And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks at the other and goes, 'What the blank is water?'" That's a social imaginary. Like, we're in it. We're so in it that we don't know that it's there. It's just part of how we live and breathe and move and have our being. Yet human beings are not goldfish. The water we live in is language. When the images we make from our imaginations emerge in our minds from a precognitive state, they accumulate meaning through language. Thus, while a distinction, and this whole book could be written on this, so we won't go there, but a distinction between image and word is helpful and important to maintain and understand, we must also consider the way in which both our individual imaginations and our social imaginaries are influenced by language. Now I'm going to cite a few examples and explanation of this from sort of a foundational book by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson called Metaphors We Live By. Now, Charles Taylor talks about the social imaginaries, which is sort of a precognitive collection of stories, images, and metaphors that is underlying, and I will give you concrete examples in a minute. Lakoff and Johnson, in sort of a parallel way, talk about our conceptual system that is made up from language. And so, as with Taylor's social imaginary, Lakoff and Johnson explain, our conceptual system is not something we are aware of. And so what they do in this book, and it's fascinating, and I'm just going to give a few examples, is they go through the English language and show how all language is metaphorical, is basically what they argue. And there are different categories for how these metaphors developed. So they give a list in one chapter that categorizes the metaphors that are spatial. So this would include how we wake up, we rise early, we fall ill, we fall asleep, we take control over, we decline an invitation, we feel inclined, we feel down, we are on top of the situation. All of those words, up, down, top, they're all spatial. We say them, and we're not actually thinking that anymore. That's how metaphorical language becomes. I mean, unless you're somebody who's like into the dad jokes. My husband's not a dad, but he's like the king of the dad jokes. So every time I say, I'm going to run to the store, he says, why don't you take the car? I'm flying to Florida. Don't let your wings get tired. Like this is the kind of stuff we're talking about. All language is metaphorical. It's all a sign pointing to something that is not that thing. And this entire book is like that. And they're not, coming from a Christian worldview, but it's very illuminating about how central the metaphors of our language are to the way we think. So I'm hoping you'll see a few of the threads that I want to bring together coming together here. Don't tell me if you're not. It'll make me feel bad. But so all language is metaphorical, and not just in the way that we learn about in junior high about metaphors and similes and those, although those are very good, metonymy and all those other figures of speech. But part of what fuels and makes our social imaginaries are the conceptual frameworks that are constituted by language. Many things contribute to these precognitive frameworks that we inherit and to the ingredients of our social imaginaries. Much comes broadly from our particular time, place, culture, in ways that aren't necessarily straightforward or simple. Creative works, which are intentionally made works of the imagination, contribute greatly to our social imaginaries, obviously. And yet there are other images and ideas and metaphors that aren't consciously creative works, but they are part of the work of the imagination, and they can accrue meaning and power over us. They become unexamined drivers that move us toward a vision of the good life that we may not even be aware of for what it is or what role it plays in our lives. Now, a couple of works of art that I'll point to that kind of do this in a very conscious way, have this sort of image or metaphor that holds meaning. One is, these are classics, so you either know them well or have never heard of them. But in Citizen Kane, one of the greatest films ever made, that image is of Rosebud. I'm not going to give anything away, because if you haven't seen it, you need to watch it. Most of you have probably seen the film version of the film version. The book is different. It's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. No, that's the book, I think. Either one, in both the book and the film, that image is like a golden ticket. Right? Getting that golden ticket is the key to the good life. And for Winston Smith in George Orwell's 1984, it's a beautiful glass paperweight containing a piece of pink coral. In each of these works of art, film, or novel, each of these objects becomes for its possessor an emblem of their vision of the good life. And we see these not only in literature and art, but even real life is filled with such emblems that represent the attainment of our greatest longings. One of my favorite works of literature to talk about in this context is Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman. Do we know, anyone here know that? Okay, the English majors, yeah. So in this play, Willy Loman has this emblem that represents for him the attainment of the good life. And it's a pair of green velvet slippers. Willy Loman in the play leads the quintessential American life, characteristic of what Henry David Thoreau meant when he wrote a century earlier that the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. Willie's case of desperation is cloaked in the glossy veneer of the American dream, beneath which, however, we find an empty, corrupted version of a once honorable ideal. When the play opens, Willie is dying. His memory is failing. He constantly tells his sons that the key to success in life is being well-liked. But as his appearances decline and his old contacts and his sales business disappear, his sales diminish and his failures increase until he is fired and his world crashes. Now, the title of the work has two references in the play, and they are inextricably linked. The first, spoiler alert, is the ending. It's death. There's a death of a salesman. Okay, sorry. That's how it ends. But the other is in another story, that's a story within the story in the play. It's kind of like that pink coral inside Winston Smith's glass. And this is the story of another salesman that Willie met years ago. His name is Dave Singleman. And by the way, all of the names in the play are very metaphorical. Willie Lowman, he's like a low, ordinary man as opposed to the nobility of classical tragedy. Dave Singleman is a person of single purpose and unity. Dave Singleman is someone that Willie met when Dave was 84 years old and at the end of his very successful sales career. And Willie says of Dave that he would put on his green velvet slippers and pick up his phone and call the buyers, and without ever leaving his room, he made his living. So Willie became beholden to a vision for success that belonged to someone else. Willie decided that selling was the greatest career a man could want. What could be more satisfying, he asked. For when Dave Singleman died all those years ago, Willie says, he died the death of a salesman in his green velvet slippers in the smoker of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford going into Boston. When he died, hundreds of salesmen and buyers were at his funeral. For Willie, the velvet green slippers symbolized the attainment of his deepest longing, to be well-liked. This is the desire formed in Willie's imagination, conscripted within him more and more deeply over time as he lives his life according to the habits and rituals of a corrupted American dream, one marked by shiny cars, new appliances, and whipped cheese in a can. This false vision of the good life that drives him for the rest of his life ultimately drives him to his death. As the vision falters and with it Willie's own moral imagination, Willie emerges late in the play from one of his reveries into the past with the sudden realization that in his life nothing's planted. I don't have a thing in the ground, he says. So he rushes off late at night to the hardware store to get some seeds. His older son Biff finds him outside later, late at night, planting them. And the action is, of course, emblematic. It's not literal seeds that Willie has neglected to plant, but the seeds of enduring real values that he realizes only now he has failed to implant in his sons. At one point near the end of the play, Biff, the elder son, says to his father, "We never told the truth for 10 minutes in this house." Biff goes on to tell Willie that Willie had so blown Biff full of hot air while he was growing up, the hot air of unrealistic expectations and false illusions, that Biff never realized the difference between a false vision and a true one until it's almost too late. But finally, it's too late for Willie, but Biff realizes, all I want is out there waiting for me the minute I say I know who I am. Now, why did Willie's life as a salesman constitute the pursuit of a false dream? There's nothing wrong with being a salesman. But the play makes clear that in pursuing that dream, Willie suppressed his true nature and sold himself out to become something he wasn't called to be. We learn from various revelations in the play that it wasn't making sales that made Willie happy. It was making things with his hands. Reflecting upon Willie's self-inflicted death, his son realizes there were a lot of nice days when he'd come home from a trip or on Sundays making the stoop, finishing the cellar, putting on the new porch, when he built the bedroom and put up the garage. There's more of him in that front stoop than in all the sales he made. And after the funeral, Biff says of his father, he had the wrong dreams, all wrong. He never knew who he was. The man didn't know who he was. And in not knowing who he was, Willie bought into a false vision of what it was he should become. What he thought was the American dream turned out to be for him simply an unexamined assumption built on a metaphor within a social imaginary that was distorted and incomplete, as all of ours are. The modern Christian imagination, along with the various social imaginaries that fuel it, are filled with such unexamined assumptions. These unexamined assumptions, our language, our metaphors, our images, our myths, legends, and stories, be they true or false or some mixture in between, form the modern Christian imaginary, driving our beliefs, practices, and expectations in ways we too often don't consider in light of unchanging biblical truth. Now, I have a short list of just a couple examples I want to throw out there. Each one of these could take a whole other hour to discuss. And you know, I'll save for the Q&A your comments or questions about where you might want to go further with any of these, or offer different ones. And I'm sure I'm going to step on some toes on in this part, but oh well. But going back to the Victorian literature class I asked you to imagine, one of the things that really helped me to see what was happening when my students and I began to ask, you know, is this subcultural teaching Christian or is it just Victorian? Is that Victorian literature is filled with a lot of stories of women whose lives were ruined by a sexual double standard that said, it's okay for the man, but not for the woman. And that any sexual transgression would have dramatically different consequences for women than for men. And Tess of the D'Urbervilles is a great example, one of my favorite novels. There are lots of others. So we would read this literature, and my students, who grew up, many of them, within an evangelical subculture, would talk about how this is what they were taught, in 20th century, the 20th century American church. And it has a name. It's called purity culture. Now, purity culture, as a metaphor, as a term, is very different from purity, the kind of purity that the Bible talks about. And if we don't make that distinction, and we take one metaphor that's come out of culture and transpose that on a biblical idea, a lot of damage can ensue. So that's just one example of that's a big one that a lot of people have been talking about for a long time, but it's I think a good example. There's one that I came up with just in conversation. This is what my whole book is about, is all these metaphors, by the way. So there's one that I came up with that didn't make the book because I thought of it afterwards, which is an ongoing frustration for any writers, is the term backsliding, right? If you're a Christian, you don't want to backslide, right? And I don't remember if it was a meme or something I saw, and I don't even think it had to do with the Christian version of backsliding, but it just made me think of this, that if we have what I think is a more biblical expectation and understanding of the Christian walk, we will know that there are good days and bad days, and we go forward, we go backward. And that if we actually if we use a different metaphor from backsliding, and now I'm going to mess this up because I'm not good with the jokes and then whatever, but that like 1 step forward, 2 steps back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, that's a cha-cha. Right? It has a different, there's steps forward and steps back. I'm not a good dancer either, but you get the idea. Like, the Christian life is a cha-cha, right? And that has and now I'm not saying this is the best metaphor, but I'm giving you an example of how a different metaphor gives us a different expectation of what our lives are supposed to look like. It's not all forward every single day, every moment of the day. And then I do have a chapter on this one in my book. It's testimony. Testimony is really, really important in the Bible. And it's really, really important to evangelicals today. But we've kind of distorted it a little bit when we talk about giving your testimony, as though there should be just one, right? And it's shorthand for a certain one we're talking about. It might be our salvation testimony. But still, if we use that language of giving your testimony, it kind of comes gets funneled into one particular experience, and the focus becomes on the moment of conversion as opposed to God's continuing work of sanctification in our lives. Then we just sort of have the metaphor distorts what I think is an important biblical truth. Again, I'll throw one more out there before I wrap up and get to the questions I promised to give you time for. And this is what, I grew up as a Christian in a very godly home, but I'm old and lived in the very rural area, and it was before the internet, so I didn't really grow up within what we would call evangelical subculture. I feel somewhat thankful for that. But a lot of my students would talk about this thing called quiet time. Like, and feeling guilt and shame and making up rules and regulations for this thing that they were supposed to have called quiet time. Well, I just want my quiet time all day long, every day. Like, it has nothing to do with what they were talking about, but it's a metaphor, and it comes to mean something and also perhaps distort what each person's individual relationship with the Lord might be like on a daily basis, or should be like for that person on a daily basis. Those are just a couple of examples. So the truth is that all of our metaphors, all of our language, the works of imagination, good, bad, the idioms, the great books, the visual art, the cheesy love songs, the Budweiser beer commercials or conspiracy theories, TikTok videos, airbrush selfies, all of those things shape our individual imaginations and our social imaginaries, for good and for ill. But the work of renewal begins with examination of all of these, even our favorite Christian images and metaphors, all of them against the light of God's unchanging truth. I welcome your questions and your comments, and thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Pryor. We've got about 13 minutes, and so we'll take your questions, try to be brief so that we can get as many questions as we can. So here you go.
Hi, I'm Danielle Matson. Thank you so much for being here. Just a couple quick questions. Number one, when is the last time that God blew your mind with a new revelation? And number two, is there a desire of your heart over many years that you got to see go from an imagination to...
The second question is fading. Okay.
Pardon me.
Yeah.
And the second question is there something that you had a longing for? It was an imagination, an image, and you got to see it come into fruition.
Oh my goodness. Okay. All right. So the first one was, when was the last time God blew my mind? He blows my mind like every day. I'm a person who I stress about details. Where's Rebecca? Okay. I stress about details, so I try to give those over to the Lord. And so I don't, this might not be biblical, it's a metaphor I made up. But God is like the God of my calendar. And like, I cannot tell you the number of days where I just feel like I can't do something, I can't take one more thing, but I don't want to cancel this or that, and then like God ordains it. Like it just, and that like blows my mind every time, because it's a small thing, but for me the small things become much bigger than they should be, because that's just how I am. So there's just lots of small ways all the time that God blows my mind. There are big ways too, but that would take too long. And then, wait, what was this? I had an answer, but what was the question? Oh, deep longing of my heart. Yeah. So in my forthcoming book on calling and vocation, I will use this, I will give half of this example, and it's an example of, because I talk about the American dream, I think, in that book. Yes, I do. Or in the last one. I'm sorry, it's all jumble in my head. But I do want to I'm going to long answer it. I do want to talk a little bit more about the American dream, which I only mentioned in the context of the play here, because that is one of the best examples of something in a social imaginary. You don't have to talk about the American dream. You don't have to say the words American dream, but your lives are being shaped and affected by the American dream every day simply because we live in that culture. So some of you who, you're in your 20s or 30s and you haven't launched, or you don't have your house, or you're not married, and you don't have kids, and your parents are disappointed in you, or your Aunt Betty is disappointed in you, or you're disappointed in yourself, and there's no reason to be, it's because we have this unexamined sort of expectation that we've inherited from our culture about what life should look like when you're in your 20s or 30s, and that's called part of that is the American dream. There's a lot of other things, but that metaphor is out there, and it's causing a lot of people anxiety. It's also offering goals and ambitions that might be fine, but it's influencing your life in more ways than you might realize. For me, when my husband, it took us a long time to buy our first house. And I had a lot of anxiety about that. And I look back, or at some point I said, why am I upset? Like, why? This is like a long time ago, before it was impossible to buy a house for anyone. But I finally asked myself, why? I have everything in life. All these other things, why do I see myself as a failure because we haven't bought a house? And then we did buy the house, and it turned out to be a nightmare. Like, we couldn't get rid of that thing for years. Okay, all that to say, that part went wrong. But when I was a very little girl, we went to visit some distant relatives, and they had an old brick house in the country. And I didn't even realize it. I just always wanted an old brick house in the country. And the Lord gave that to me, like 25 years ago, but we still have to do a lot of work on it. But yeah, that was a dream. I feel like the Lord, I always say when somebody built that house in 1912, it was built for me.
Thanks. I have a quick question. How do you distinguish between social imaginaries and worldview? How do you see them connected?
Oh, I am so glad you asked that question. I actually usually address that, so thank you. So, I'm just repeating the question because I don't know, for me it's a little distorted. But what's the difference between social imaginary and biblical worldview, essentially, right? So, biblical or Christian worldview is very cognitive. Worldview is saying, oh, what does the Bible say about this and how does it apply to that? When I discovered Christian worldview as a college or grad school age Christian, that changed my life. Because for me, it just made everything make sense. I love Christian worldview because I like to think about things. But what I realized in studying James K. Smith and others is that not everyone is wired that, like, everyone doesn't live, trying to apply thinking to certain things. So social imaginaries are precognitive. So it's like we like the American dream. You might not think about it or talk about it, but it's sort of an expectation that's held out there because we live in this community. So it's precognitive, it's metaphorical, it's stories, it's just these expectations, like this is what life should look like, and you may not even realize it. I mean, that's, film and art fuels so much of that. You should follow your dreams, pursue your passion, and you might not realize that you're doing this thing the world tells you to do, and if you're not succeeding at it, you're feeling disappointed or upset, and you don't even know why. You feel like because you haven't articulated it, you haven't applied thinking to it. So worldview is cognitive, analytical, applying things in a very conscious way, and the social imaginary is sort of precognitive, under the level metaphor stories that we might not realize are driving us. Does that make sense? Okay.
Hello.
Hello.
It's the English major in the crowd. I had one question. So if you had to nail down like one specific, the most detrimental metaphor plaguing the contemporary church, what do you think? Or maybe you can do top three. I don't.
Okay. So it would be empire. Evangelicalism that developed in the 18th century in England grew up alongside the growth of the British Empire. Evangelicalism matured when the British Empire matured in the 19th century, at a time when the British Empire covered 1/4 of the globe, and it could be said literally that the sun, they used to say the sun never sets on the British Empire. Well, it was true according to the time zones. And even though we don't think about empire, We are very much an American, of course there are exceptions, I'm speaking in broad generalizations, but we have this idea that bigger is better and more is better. And we think about, we think about counting the number of hands raised or conversions as opposed to quality. So we focus so much on power and empire mentality that we've inherited for a long time. It takes different forms, but I think it's still very much part of our thinking as American evangelicals. Oh, I'm not doing the calling on, sorry. I'm still in my classroom in my mind.
Thank you for that conversation. I'm older, I'm not a student, so you successfully blew a lot of rust out of this old brain in some of that conversation, but I was thinking when you were speaking of how awesome God is in his imagination, that the earth was formless and void, knew nothing, and he created this as we look around as a testimony to, I think, what we can become in our imaginative states as we live our lives. And I was thinking of the young people in here, that are planning the life ahead. I'm sort of on the other side looking back. They're planning ahead. And I would say, there's a question at the end of this, but don't think small. Your life matters. God is the God of the universe that wants to use each person here in such a big imaginative way. And so I guess I would say, in your assessment, do you think we're living under our level of potential of imagination for what we can do for God?
Yeah, that's a good question, but it depends on what you mean by big and under the level. Because again, I've taught generations of students who were told to do big things for God, just to use that phrase. And when they just simply lived ordinary lives and didn't become celebrities or found major missions movements, they felt like they had failed God somehow, or that worse, that God had failed them. So I think we have to be careful about what we mean about going big or going home or thinking in too small a way, because I think that the most ordinary things we do in everyday life can also be miracles and can be God manifesting himself in huge ways in our lives that we can't always see or measure.
Thank you so much. My question is also about the social imaginary. You mentioned it relates to cultural and subcultural groups and some of the encounters people have when traveling. Would you mind speaking to how that relates to global media, which is now, the American dream is obviously held by people who are not American, and the ability of images to shape and transform us on a global level?
Yeah, so just to be clear, we all exist in social imaginaries, no matter where we live or when we live. This is just a term that Taylor and others use to talk about how our communities are shaped by inherited metaphors and symbols. And so what's changed now that I think you're getting at is that we're no longer confined to our geographical, community. We can live in one geographical community and then be exposed to the ideas and metaphors and dreams and visions of others as well. And so I think that is part of what globalization means. And it can be good, and it can also be bad, because people can be looking on social media and having expectations that, for themselves that are not available where they live and so forth. But it's also, even within our own community, I don't want to pick on but any person looking at social media images and seeing someone else doing something that is decontextualized and you can't see what's behind it or what is actually happening, it's distorting all of our dreams and visions and expectations. So cross-culturally, but also just, even in our own culture.
Okay, we've got time for one quick question, so you get the last question.
I just want to just thank the older gentleman for bringing up that question of how big our imagination can be. And I just wanted to look back to, as a child, our imagination was more, the little kids, ponies and superheroes, things of that came from their worldly perception. And I want to just bring up a comment that you had earlier. Imagination is drawn from what we perceive. And I want to ask the question, if we don't have these experiences, how can we perceive?
Read books. We can. That is just one way that we can we can experience vicariously so many other people's experiences and understandings and perceptions. This is what Aristotle was talking about in Poetics, that we can experience things vicariously that we couldn't in real life. And reading other art is great too, but I'm a little partial to books. But if we can read stories by so many different writers across time and space and understand the world in their terms without abandoning our own worldview or losing our sense of self, we can just, well, C.S. Lewis has a lot to say about this, so read a lot of good books.
Let's give Dr. Pryor another hand of applause.
Thank you.